Hello, my name's Rich, and I'm with Cindy. We're on the sailing vessel Legacy and at toatsea.com. I'd like to do a series of videos about how we plan our passage weather windows. I don't claim to have any special knowledge, although we've been doing it for about 10 years and are doing fairly well at it. There's the kind of thing they say that gets you in trouble. But I see a lot of people ignoring things that I think are very important. So I'm just going to go through the process, kind of a stream of consciousness about how we do it and the tools we use to plan our weather windows. Right now we're sitting in New Caledonia, right here at that white dot, and we're planning a passage to Gladstone, which is over here somewhere in Australia. And right now there are no good weather windows on the horizon, but I'm going to start now, and then every day I'm going to do another video. This first one's going to be a longer and more in-depth one as I explain the tools, and then I'll just go through the process that I do every morning when I look for a window. So first, I'm using a tool from PredictWind, PredictWind.com, and it's really become my favorite. There are other tools that work fine. Windy is great, but PredictWind has such great tools to assist you, and 6 weather models as well, which gets confusing at a time. But let me just start from the beginning and what we do. So first, I'm going to look at the Isobar Map. Isobar Map shows rain, which shows the fronts very clearly, and wind with the barbs, and isobars. And I'll usually zoom out quite a ways, and I'll usually pick something like ECMWF as my model to start with. And I'll get into that more in a second. So I'll just zoom through and see what the upcoming weather looks like. So right now, if we were to leave, we'd be going upwind. The wind is from the west, and we need to go west. Now here, Thursday evening, afternoon, right down here, it says Thursday at 6 p.m., 6:30. Wind is turning south and then goes southeast. And it looks like maybe a potential for a departure. There's a front coming through, but it doesn't quite reach up far enough. And then the wind gets very light, so we'd be motoring. Leaving Thursday night looks like a potential window. I'm recording this on Wednesday, so that's not going to happen. We'll never get it together in time to go. And also, here comes a bunch of kind of bad-looking, probably thunderstorms and squalls with this rain band, with this front. So let's look at some other models. But first, let's look at how we determine what model to use, or how I determine what model to use. Right now, I have its location is outside of Nemea. And we'll go to a tool called Validation over here on the left-hand side. And when we do that, it says no validation data available. So let's try another location. Let's try something pretty popular. Let's try Denarau in Fiji, which is a ways away from us, but maybe in the same weather band, so maybe these numbers are accurate. So what it shows us here is, for Denarau at least, the PWE and PWG models are number 1 and number 2 for wind speed in the past week. For wind direction, it's PWE and ECMWF in the past week. We go over here, and in the past month, it's been PWE and PWG for wind speed, and ECMWF and PWE for wind direction. So PWE is looking really consistent here. So maybe let's go back and do that Isobar map again with PWE. Now it centers on Fiji because that's what we picked, but we're going to zoom out. We're going to select PWE model and see what the Isobar map looks like. Okay, again, the wind's against us. Thursday afternoon it turns south, so we could sail in that. It turns southeast, which would be wonderful. Doesn't look bad at all. It looks possible. There's really no fronts coming through. We might be just above this one or just past this one by the time it forms. And then we run out of data. We'd be in by the time this happens. So it's looking possible for Friday afternoon. That's going to upset Cindy because we'd have to scramble like crazy to get it ready to go. Let's take a look at a couple of other things. Let's go ahead and look at the seas, wave maps. there's a big low down here off New Zealand, and that's probably generating some seas coming up into our route. So let's take a look at that. If we were to leave Thursday, okay, we have winds kind of in front of the beam, 1.6 meters at 8.9 seconds. That's not terrible. Let's see what happens. It's getting a little worse, 1.9 meters at 8.5 seconds. That's a deal breaker for us. The 1.9 meters, 6 feet isn't so bad, but the 8 seconds in that neighborhood gets really steep and really hard to make progress in and very uncomfortable. So fortunately for us, as far as having to get ready to go tomorrow, it looks like this isn't a favorable passage. But let's look in more depth. Let's take a look at a weather routing. So we go down here to Tools, go to Weather Routing, and we put the green dot where we start, the red dot where we want to finish. I actually have that route saved. I've called it Gladstone, so we've got that. And let's pick a start time of Thursday at 4 p.m. That looks good. And hit the route button. Now I'm going to speed through this because it'll take about 2 minutes. Okay, here's the weather routing, and it'll show whatever data we want. Let's go look at PWE again because that was number 1 on the validation, at least for Fiji. So let's look at that. We'll just slide through here. There's leaving Thursday. Okay, the wind's kind of behind us at 15 knots. Boy, that looks really nice. Then it goes light. We'd be motoring. Ooh, this coming up doesn't look so good. We're this boat here with the red track. That would be PWE. So we have a little bit of time where it's against us, but it's pretty short-lived. It's getting strong. It's ahead of the beam now. Not too bad. Now, pictures are one thing, but let's actually look at some data. Here's the graphs, and these are really handy. One is by looking at all these models kind of converging and giving more or less the same forecast, I have a lot of confidence that they're pretty accurate. And we see that the wind gets up to about 20 knots maximum. Now, that's not gusts, that's sustained wind. True wind direction, for me, this is kind of hard to read, so I don't really look at the wind direction or wind angle there. I do look at the rain because here, when we see this rain, if that's during a period of high winds, it might be really squally. And we can look here and we can see that, well, the winds are below 15 when that happens. And the same with CAPE, convective available potential energy. I never get that right. It's getting kind of high there, but again, it's at a period where the winds aren't so high, so I'm not as worried about that. I don't really pay attention to temperature, but wave height is really important to us. And it's showing it's, about 2 meters, but again, what I care about is both the height and the period. So let's go take a look at that with the data on waves. And here we'll look at PWE. So we start out at 1.5, 1.6 meters at 10 seconds, 10.7 seconds. Not bad, 10.2. We get up to almost 2 meters at 10.6 seconds. That's not so bad. The waves would be kind of behind us at 204 degrees, not terrible. Then the waves go south. The period starts to get shorter, but the wave height's coming way down. And here, I think when we're talking about 1 meter waves, we're really just talking about wind chop mostly, so that doesn't look bad at all. Let me also look at ECMWF. Now, that's a little bit more scary, but it's 10.7 seconds, so that's not terrible. And I look down here and see when it comes down below 10 seconds. It's 1.3, 1.2, 1.1 at 8 seconds. Doesn't look bad at all. And again, I'm going to check GFS as well. 1.8 meters, 9.4 seconds. Not bad. When it goes up above 2 meters, 2.6 meters, it's 10.5 seconds. That's not bad at all. Let's go back and look and see visually what direction the waves are in. And we'll look at PWE here. We'll select waves and we'll scroll through our route. Here it's easier to see which way the waves are coming. And Before, when I looked at the numbers, I thought that was kind of behind us. It's not. It's actually kind of in front of us. I just read it wrong. So as long as I've been doing this, I make those kinds of mistakes all the time. I hope you're better at it than I am. But now this a whole new light lends a whole new light because these waves are kind of in front of us. So that's more significant. And now they're on the beam. With legacy, waves on the beam are pretty uncomfortable. And now they're coming around behind us more. Now they're ahead of us again. They're pretty small here. They're 1.4 meters, but they're 8 seconds. And they're on the beam or just ahead of the beam. So I'm not thinking that's going to be very comfortable. Let's go back to the tables and look at the wind more closely. Look at PWE again, and I generally look at the true wind speed, gusts, and the true wind angle. Now remember, that's the true wind angle, so the wind's going to come in front of the beam more than that to account for apparent wind. So here we have pretty light wind. Gusts aren't very high. Wind is behind the beam. That all looks really nice. That looks kind of ideal. Here we're motoring, so we spend about a day motoring. I don't mind that. Actually, more than a day motoring. I don't mind that. We have an engine. We're not afraid to use it. The wind does come around on the nose here, but it's pretty light. It's 8 knots gusting to 9, so that's not a problem. 10 knots gusting to 11. It's still in front of the beam, and considerably in front of the beam. This would be beating into 13 knots, 14. Really no gusts to speak of. The wind goes light again. Here it's still well in front of the beam at 10 or 12 knots. You know, it's not my favorite, but we could make good progress in that. We could probably sail about what this indicates right here. Okay, and why does it indicate the speed it does? This is our boat speed. It does because we have to enter our boat polars before we do a routing. And the more accurate that is, the more accurate the routing you get will be. So I've picked for legacy a Catalina 38, a Sparkman and Stevens design, a Beneteau 317. I know that's nothing like our boat, but the performance seems to be very similar to what we've done over passages through the last, say, 20,000 miles. And I derate that Beneteau by 80% upwind and downwind. I don't have any different derating at night. I guess that's a neat feature. And you can actually see the performance polars over here. So it's important that you get the polars right. And we've also said that we're willing to motor at 5 knots if our boat speed drops to less than 5.1. That's a decision you have to make for your own boat. I'd love to be able to sail along at 3.5 or 4 knots, but it seems with all this advanced information, we know that we're racing a front in and we have to get in at a certain time or we hit bad weather. And we don't seem to have the luxury with this modern technology to sail along comfortably at 3 or 4 knots and, spend a glorious day at sea going slow. We usually have to fire up the engine and keep the speed up in order to beat in a front or some kind of a system. So that's where these numbers come from. Now let's go to the summary and see how they compare to real life for legacy. So here's a summary of all the models, and let's look at PWE. It says our average speed is going to be 5.5 knots on this passage, or 5.4 with some of the other models. We've got enough experience now to know that that's very realistic. If we saw that that was 7 knots, we know we could never make that. If we saw it was only 4 knots, we know we can do better than that. So that's a double check on how accurate the polars are for your particular boat. Passage time is always interesting, 6.5 days. Motoring time, 2 days or 3 days. Again, we don't mind that for us. Some people, the engine drives them crazy and they could never do that. We'd rather have a lighter wind passage where we have to motor for 2 days than get beat up for 2 or 3 days. Maximum wind speed is interesting, but what's really interesting are the maximum gusts. And we have 27 knots here, 28 knots on ECMWF. So we could say the gusts are probably going to be close to 30 knots. They always seem to be higher than that. And the other thing that's interesting is the upwind reaching versus downwind time. 7% upwind, 18% upwind. Reaching sometimes that seems to translate to upwind by the time you factor in apparent wind. So that's a high percentage reaching. The time you spend in each wind range is interesting. PWE has us spending no time in 20 to 30 knots. Again, that's not accounting for gusts, because look, here's gusts at 27 knots. And then the time you spend in sea states between 1 and 2 meters or 2 to 3 meters is all very useful for us and some stuff we look at. So that looks kind of possible. I'd say for us, we're not going to take that window because of the sea state. It's going to be ahead of the beam, it's going to be fairly large, and when it's not fairly large, it's going to be fairly short period. So I'd say while the wind looks ideal, we wouldn't be very comfortable on this passage, so it's one we'd pass on. But I wonder what the next day looks like. It would be nice if there's some easy way to tell. There is. Let's go to departure planning. We can go to the same route here. We can go to the start time. We can set the same start time, but now we can space departures by 24 hours. So this is going to give us a departure on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at 4 p.m. So let's calculate that and see what we've got. Okay, here's the results of the departure planning. Let's go to PWE again, which we decided looked like it's performing best in this area, or at least Fiji. And let's scroll through the different departures. So our first boat's going to leave on Thursday at 4, and this is what it's going to encounter. Okay, here we have a second boat leaving at Friday at 4. Boy, that Friday looks pretty good too. Saturday, okay, Saturday hits light air pretty quickly. And our Friday departure is getting headed a little bit here. The wind's coming around onto the nose. So that looks like a bit of a no-go. Saturday departure is interesting. It goes further north. It stays in this light wind area for quite a while. Let's see what happens to that. The wind looks good for that Saturday departure so far. It's downwind now. Unfortunately, a little more than 2 days out, and we're getting headed in 15 knots. Okay, it doesn't last long. It goes fairly light. Again, 15 knots. Okay, now we've run out of data. So Saturday is a possibility. Normally, if I were really desperate to plan a departure, I'd go do a routing on that Saturday and then look at all the details, especially the sea state. There's one other thing I wanted to point out here. In planning preferences, you can pick which models are used for your departure planning. I have PWG, PWE, ECMWF, and GFS. Truthfully, I don't use Spire or UCMA very much, although maybe I should be, but I get a little overloaded with the amount of data. I like the term analysis paralysis, and that's what I feel like happens to me when I have too many watches to check the time on. Okay, so I just lost internet, which is a consequence of being in a place like New Caledonia or Fiji or other places, although Fiji's internet's very good. But fortunately, I've kind of come to an end of what I'm looking at right now. Tomorrow, I'll look at a Saturday departure probably, see how things have changed, and I'll do a separate video for that. And I'll do a video every day going through these things, maybe not in as much detail as this one, until we find a weather window. And then when we get there, I'll do another video talking about how it worked out and how it compared to what we planned. Thanks for joining me. Sorry it was so long. The next ones will be shorter. Thanks.